Hi everybody, Miss Smith here, back for another read from our new book, Chocolate Fever. We know that we met Henry, and he is somebody who loves chocolate and eats chocolate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks in between, and probably brushes his teeth using a chocolate bar. Who knows? This kid seems pretty crazy for chocolate. Yesterday we ended with Henry in class, and the teacher's up at the board and she's doing a math problem, and then she realizes Henry's staring at his arm, and she calls on him, and he says not the answer to the math problem, but he says, "There's little brown spots all over my arm." Chapter 3 starts off, Mrs. Kimmelfarber's problem. As soon as Henry said that, there was a silence in the room for about 2 seconds. Then there was a riot. All the girls began to giggle. The boys chortled and chuckled and laughed right out loud. And Henry turned red. And Mrs. Kimmelfarber, who did not appreciate the humor of this at all, turned white. She rapped her ruler against the desk and shouted for silence. "Henry Green," she said, "what is the meaning?" "Little brown spots all over my arm," said Henry. "I was looking at my arm and I have these." "Yes, Henry, we heard you. Little brown spots all over. I heard you quite clearly the first time. But, Mrs. Kimmelfarber, I didn't have these spots my whole life. I didn't even have them this morning, but now I..." "Yes," Mrs. Kimmelfarber said, "you now have them all over. I'd better take a look at them." So taking Henry's arm, she led him to the window. She said as she peered at his arm. "This looks like freckles to me, Henry." "No, ma'am," said Henry. "It just can't be freckles." "Well, why ever not?" said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Because I have clear and delicate skin, like my mother." "Is that so?" said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "And who told you that?" "Well, my father told me that." "Ah," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber, "exactly. Now, you're sure you didn't observe this phenomenon before this morning?" If that means, did I see them?" said Henry. "No, I've never seen these spots ever." "Well then," she said, "you, Henry Green, stand right where you are. And class," she said, looking to face the room, "you will continue to look at your books until I return, in perfect silence." She added as she went out into the hall. Henry stood, as told, while the class looked at him. Mrs. Kimmelfarber walked the few steps down the hall to Mr. Pangolo's room. She looked through the door and waited until Mr. Pangolo glanced in her direction. Catching his eye, she waved him out into the hallway, like, "Come here, come here." "Listen, Phil," she began earnestly, "I want you to take a look at a kid." "For heaven's sake, Dolores," said Mr. Pangolo, "I'm right in the middle of a lesson." "This boy has little brown spots all over his arms." "Little brown spots? You got me out of my class to talk about little brown spots?" "Well, I thought maybe they might be measles." "Oh, no. Said Mr. Pangolos. "Maybe chicken pox?" said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "No," said Mr. Pangolos. "I better just take a look at this." So the two of them turned Henry to the light near the window, right in the corner where the potted plants were growing on the window ledge. Mr. Pangolos poked and prodded. So here they are, taking a look at Henry's arm, and now his face looks like it has some dots on it. Mr. Pangolos poked and prodded and even took his eyeglasses out of his pocket and put them on. "Freckles," he said finally, "just plain old freckles." "Are you sure?" Mr. Pangolo's round nose twitched and he sniffed the air. "Chocolate?" he said. "Have they brought chocolate milk upstairs from the cafeteria?" "Forget the milk," she cried. "Look, now he has them on his face." "Oh, no," said Henry. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. Oh my, said Mr. Pongolos. And they weren't there before? Nope. 2 minutes ago, the boy's face was as clear as day. And now, Henry felt as if his heart were about to drop into his shoes. He swallowed hard and stared at the two teachers, who were staring at his face. And now, little brown spots all over, said Mrs. Kimmelfarber, and I see more of them coming out even as we speak. A tear, just one tear, welled up in Henry's right eye and began to trickle down his cheek, running slowly in and out of the little brown spots. Chapter 4. Pop! Dirt breeds germs. Nurse Molly Farthing would often say this, and germs have a nasty way of making healthy people ill. Naturally, the infirmary of PS 123, and infirmary means nurse's office. The infirmary was always spotless because Nurse Molly Farthing wouldn't have it any other way. And naturally, as Mrs. Kimmelfarber and Henry rushed through the door that morning, she made both of them go back and wipe their feet on the mat. And don't bring any of your cocoa in here, Nurse Farthing added. She sniffed the air loudly. Cocoa, said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. Yeah, I smell cocoa. Don't think I don't smell it, Nurse Farthing said. Please, Nurse Farthing, said Mrs. Kimmelfarber, we have an emergency on our hands. This is Henry Green. He's breaking out in a rash of some sort. So I see, said Nurse Farthing. She sat Henry down in the chair and turned on a bright light. Pushing her spectacles down to the top of her nose like this, she's looking at him. It looks like a rash, all right, she said at last. Peculiar. Looks like little brown spots all over. Exactly, Mrs. Kimmelfarber said. And what is it? Well, have you ever had the measles? Nurse Farthing asked. Yep, said Henry, when I was 5. Chicken pox? She asked. When I was 3.5, answered Henry. Then I would say you have an unidentified rash, and frankly, I do not like the look of it. Henry, who up until now was merely frightened, began to feel terrified. Nurse Farthing laid her cool hand on his arm and steadied him. There, dear, she said, nothing to be frightened of. I'm sure it's not serious. How do you feel? Not very good, said Henry. Do you feel warm? No, he said. Do you feel cold? No, he answered. Do you feel dizzy? No, said Henry. I just feel strange. Oh, you poor dear, said Nurse Molly Farthing. You really must be frightened. She ran her fingers through his hair and patted the back of Henry's neck. Somehow this made him feel a little bit better until pop! Did you say something? Asked Nurse Farthing. No, ma'am, said Henry. Pop! What's that noise then? She asked. It sounds like something going pop, 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 pop. I heard it too, said Henry. So did I, said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. Pop, 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 pop. Now they all heard it. The sound of popping filled the nurse's office. Little pops and bigger pops and poppity pops and poppity pop pops kept popping. Henry looked at his arm and in an instant knew where the noise was coming from. His little tiny brown spots were growing bigger and bigger. They were popping out all over him. No longer the size of freckles, they were as big as the chocolate bits his mother used for making cakes and cookies. He could feel them popping out on his arms and face. He could feel them growing under his shirt. In less time than it takes to tell it, Henry Green was covered with little brown lumps from the top of his head to the tip of his toes. There's a picture of him with the nurse and all the popping going on. I can't wait to find out what happens next. So tune in tomorrow for Chapter 5, Calling Dr. Fargo. All right, you guys. Well, I love reading stories to you. We're going to have a class meeting tomorrow. Ask your parents to check their email. I gave directions on their email and Bloom's. I love you, Room 18, and I will see you tomorrow with Peanut and Pepper.